The quiet act, no one noticed. The rain had been falling since morning, slow and steady, soft enough to make the city streets glisten like silver ribbons. Sandra sat by the window of her small house, watching drops slide down the glass one after another, like tiny memories trying to escape her mind. The world outside looked peaceful, but inside her heart there was a quiet storm that had been there for years, something she never spoke about, something only kindness could calm. No one really knew much about her personal life anymore. They saw her on screens, smiling in interviews, always gentle, always humble. But what people didn't see were the quiet nights she spent reading letters from children in hospitals, or the long drives she took to old neighborhoods where no one recognized her. She believed kindness should never wear a name tag, and that belief led her to do something she never planned to tell anyone about. One winter evening, while filming in a small town, she had passed by a community library. The sign outside was fading, half of the lights were broken, and a handwritten note taped to the door said, "Closing soon, no funds left." Inside, through the fogged glass, she could see an old man trying to keep the shelves upright with tape and nails. Children sat on the floor, reading by the yellow glow of a single lamp. She stood there for a long time, watching quietly, her heart caught between sadness and hope. That night, she didn't sleep. She kept thinking about that library, how something so small could mean so much. She opened her laptop, looked for the town's donation registry, and sent a message from an anonymous account. The next morning, the library received a large donation. No sender name, no message. Only a note that said, "For the children who still believe stories can save the world." The old librarian cried that morning. He called the mayor. He called the news. Everyone wanted to know who had done it, but no one could find out. And while reporters tried to trace the money, Sandra quietly went back to set, smiled at the camera, and said nothing. Years passed. The library not only survived, it grew. New walls, new books, and a bright blue roof. Children ran inside every morning like it was a new adventure. The librarian hung that same note on the entrance door. No one ever took it down. But kindness, no matter how quietly given, always finds a voice. And one day, years later, when Sandra was sitting alone in a hotel room after another film premiere, a story on TV caught her attention. The mystery donor of Springfield Library may finally be revealed. She froze. Her hands trembled slightly. Her heart began to race. They said an accountant had traced a pattern in several donations, all made from anonymous foundations, all linked to small towns she had filmed in. The library wasn't the only one. There were hospitals, shelters, even a music school for blind children. Every time she had worked in a new place, she had left behind something quietly. Money, books, supplies, or a rebuilt roof, and she had never expected anyone to notice. She turned off the TV, leaned back, and sighed. Part of her wanted to smile. Part of her wanted to hide. She whispered to herself, it was never about being seen. But she knew the truth. If people found out, it might change everything. As the night grew colder, she remembered the old librarian's face, his tears of joy, the children's laughter echoing through the narrow halls. Maybe, she thought, even if the world found out, it was okay. Because sometimes good deeds should inspire others, even if they begin in silence. What she didn't know was that far away, in that same town, a young girl who used to visit the library every day had grown up. She was now a journalist, and she was the one who had started digging into the mystery. She didn't know who the donor was yet, but she was close, and her next stop was Hollywood. The quiet kindness that Sandra thought would stay hidden forever was about to come to light. Not as a scandal, not as fame, but as a story that would remind the world what real generosity looks like. The journalist who searched for the truth, the morning sun was soft over Los Angeles, the kind of light that made even tired hearts feel a little new. In a small apartment filled with papers and coffee cups, a young journalist named Claire sat at her desk, eyes fixed on a wall covered with notes, photos, and strings connecting them like a web of secrets. She had been chasing this mystery for almost 2 years. the story of an anonymous donor who had quietly rebuilt lives, towns, and dreams. People called her obsession strange, but to Claire it wasn't about money or headlines. It was personal. When she was 9, her mother used to take her to the small Springfield library after school. It was her favorite place in the world, warm, quiet, filled with the smell of old books and sunlight. But one winter, they found the library locked with a notice on the door that said, "Permanently closed." Claire had cried that day, thinking she had lost her only safe place. Then, almost like magic, the doors reopened a few months later. The building was repaired, the shelves full again, and new storybooks had arrived. People whispered that someone had saved it, but no one knew who. That library shaped her entire childhood. And now, as an adult reporter, she wanted to thank the person who had done it, even if she had to uncover a secret the world had forgotten. That morning, she opened a file filled with donation records, old press clippings, and local archives. There was a strange pattern. Every donation came from a foundation that existed only briefly, then disappeared. But one thing was constant. Each town matched a movie location from a single actress's career, Sandra Bullock. Claire sat still, staring at the name. At first, it felt impossible. Hollywood stars gave to charities all the time. But this wasn't normal charity. These were personal, hidden, deliberate. It was as if someone had been quietly watching where help was needed and giving it without wanting credit. She leaned back in her chair and whispered, "Could it really be her?" The thought scared her. She admired Sandra deeply. She didn't want to invade her privacy. But something told her this story mattered. Not to expose someone, but to remind people that goodness still existed. That afternoon, she packed her bag and drove to a small town where one of the donations had happened, a hospital for children with chronic illnesses. The staff there were kind, busy, and full of stories. An old nurse remembered the donation clearly. It came right after the big storm. The nurse said softly, "We thought the roof would collapse. But one morning we got a letter with a check inside. No name, just a note that said every child deserves a safe place to heal. It saved us. Do you know who sent it?" Claire asked gently. The nurse shook her head. "No, but there was something else. A volunteer who helped that week said she saw someone familiar walking by the ward one night. Wearing a hoodie, no makeup, just sitting by a child's bed, reading him a story." Claire's heart skipped a beat. "Did she say who it was?" "She said it looked like that actress." "What's her name?" "The one from the proposal." Claire froze. It was the confirmation she didn't expect to get. She left the hospital quietly, sitting in her car for a long time, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down. If this was true, if Sandra Bullock had been helping people secretly for years, how do you tell that story without breaking its purity? On her dashboard, a photo of the old library hung from a pin, the same place that had changed her life. She whispered, "Maybe she never wanted thanks. Maybe she just wanted peace." But the truth had a strange way of finding light. The story was already growing. Small whispers on blogs, short posts on social media, people connecting clues. Someone would break it eventually. Claire knew that if it had to happen, it should be told the right way, with respect, with love, and with the truth of her intention. So she booked a flight to Los Angeles. She didn't know if Sandra would ever agree to meet her, but she had to try. As her plane rose through the clouds that evening, she looked down at the city lights fading below and thought about the letter that saved her library years. Agodot, the story that began with one anonymous note, was now leading her straight to the person whose quiet kindness had changed thousands of lives, including her own, and somewhere in a quiet home across the city, Sandra sat alone again, unaware that the past she tried to keep hidden was now walking toward her, in the form of a young woman who believed that the world still needed to hear about kindness. The next morning was bright, but inside Sandra's heart the light felt heavy. She had woken up to messages from her manager, from her team, from journalists, all asking the same question. Is it true? She didn't answer any of them. Instead, she walked quietly to her kitchen, made a cup of tea, and stared at the newspaper lying on her counter. The headline read, "Anonymous Hollywood Kindness. Who is the secret donor?" and under it was a blurred picture of her from years ago, wearing a hoodie, standing outside that same hospital. Her fingers tightened around the cup. She had tried for so long to keep her name away from it all. She didn't want people to see it as charity or as something noble. She had done it because it was the only thing that made her feel human in a world that often forgot what kindness meant. She sat down and whispered to herself. They were never supposed to know. Her assistant called again. Sandra, there's a journalist who's been calling for days. Claire Dawson. She says she's not looking for gossip. She just wants to talk to you about the donations. She says it's important. Sandra closed her eyes. Claire Dawson, she repeated softly, trying to remember where she'd heard that name before. It sounded faintly familiar, like something from the past trying to resurface. She says you saved her childhood library, the assistant added. Sandra froze. Her breath caught. Her heart started to beat faster. The library? She whispered. Yes, her assistant said. She said she wants to thank you in person. For a long moment, Sandra said nothing. The memory of that little library came back. The cracked walls, the children reading on the floor, the quiet laughter she had heard through the door. She remembered the old man's kind eyes when she had slipped the note under his office door and walked away before dawn. Maybe, she thought, this girl deserved to know. Tell her to come, Sandra said softly. But no cameras, no recorders, just her. 2 days later, Claire stood in front of Sandra's house. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say 100 times, but now her hands were shaking. The gates opened quietly, and a security guard led her up a small path lined with white flowers. When the door opened, she didn't see the Hollywood star she had imagined. There was no makeup, no spotlight, no perfection. Just a woman in a simple sweater, eyes gentle, smile tired but kind. Hi, Sandra said softly. You must be Claire. Yes, Claire replied, her voice almost breaking. Thank you for seeing me. They sat on the patio, sunlight falling between the trees. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Claire placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was an old library card, her name written in messy handwriting, faded with age. This was mine, she said quietly. I grew up in that library. It closed once. I thought it was gone forever. Then it came back better than ever. I didn't know until years later that it was because of you. Sandra looked at the card for a long time. Her eyes softened and a small smile appeared. That library was full of dreams, she said. I just didn't want them to end. Why didn't you tell anyone? Claire asked gently. Because kindness loses its meaning when it's used for attention, Sandra replied. I didn't want anyone to say thank you. I just wanted those children to have a place where stories could keep them safe. That's all? Claire nodded, tears forming in her eyes. I understand, she whispered. But people deserve to know that quiet kindness still exists. They need to hear that not every good thing is done for fame. They need hope. Sandra looked away, her eyes glistening. Hope, she repeated softly. I used to think if I stayed silent, the goodness would speak for itself. But maybe the world has grown too noisy to hear silence anymore. They both sat in stillness, listening to the sound of wind through the trees. Then Claire said something that changed everything. Miss Sandra, if I tell your story, I promise it will not be about your name. It will be about your heart, about what kindness can do when no one's watching. For a long moment, Sandra didn't respond. Then she smiled faintly and whispered, If you write it that way, then yes. Tell them. As Claire drove away later that evening, she felt both heavy and light at the same time. Heavy, because she carried a truth too beautiful for the world to twist. Light, because she had seen what real humility looked like. She didn't know that Sandra, after she left, sat for a long time on the same patio, watching the sunset fade. She whispered to herself, Maybe it's time for silence to speak. But what neither of them knew was that someone else, someone from the media, had already caught wind of their meeting. And the world of gossip rarely stays quiet. By the next morning, a headline began to spread across screens again. Sandra Bullock's secret generosity finally revealed, Hollywood's quiet angel. When the world found out the morning after the news broke, the world seemed louder than ever. Phones buzzed, headlines flashed, and social media filled with words that Sandra had never wanted to read about herself. A real-life angel, the kindest star in Hollywood. Years of secret donations finally revealed, but for every word of admiration, there were others full of questions, people doubting, assuming, twisting, and analyzing her silence. She sat in her living room, barefoot, wrapped in a gray shawl, watching the news unfold quietly. Her name was everywhere, her picture on every screen. The very thing she had tried to avoid had found her. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists, talk shows, agencies, foundations, all wanting interviews, partnerships, photo sessions. She turned it all off. She didn't want noise. She wanted peace. But deep inside, she also felt something unexpected. Not regret, not pride, but a strange, gentle sadness. The kind that comes when something pure is suddenly shared with the world. The doorbell rang. It was Claire. Her eyes were full of guilt. "I didn't tell anyone," Claire said before Sandra could speak. "I swear, someone from the magazine must have found out I met you. They published everything before I could write it properly." Sandra smiled faintly. "It's okay," she said softly. "I think the truth wanted to come out on its own." "But it's not fair," Claire said. "They made it about fame again. They're saying you did it to build your image." Sandra looked at her and said quietly, "People will always see what they want to see. Kindness isn't about being believed. It's about being done." For a long moment, they both stood there in silence. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted the world to know what real good looks like," she said. "They will," Sandra replied. "Not today, maybe, not in headlines, but someone out there will feel something, and that's enough." Over the next few days, messages began to flood in from everywhere. Schools, hospitals, libraries, people who had been helped without ever knowing who had done it. They all said the same thing. "Thank you." One letter stood out. It came from a small boy named Liam, who was now 16. He had been one of the children from the hospital Sandra helped years ago. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were strong. "Dear Miss Sandra, I never knew who you were. When the hospital roof broke, we thought we'd never come back. But then someone fixed it. The nurses said it was a miracle. Now I'm healthy. I study music. I wanted to tell you that your kindness didn't just build walls, it built me. Thank you." Sandra read the letter 3 times, her eyes wet. She folded it carefully and kept it beside the photo of her late mother. Her mother had once told her, "The best gifts are the ones you give quietly." She smiled softly and whispered, "You were right." But the attention kept growing. News channels began comparing her to other celebrities. Charities tried to attach her name to their causes. Publicists wanted to use her story to inspire campaigns. She felt her simple act of kindness was slowly being turned into noise. That night, she called Claire. "Let's meet," she said. "There's something I need you to help me with." When Claire arrived, Sandra handed her a folder. Inside it were dozens of handwritten notes, receipts, and pictures from every place she had quietly helped. Shelters, schools, clinics, even old houses rebuilt for families after floods. "These are the real stories," Sandra said. "Not about me, about them. If you want to write something, write about them. Tell the world their side." Claire nodded, overwhelmed. "I will," she whispered. "I promise." "And one more thing," Sandra said with a gentle smile. "Don't end it with my name. End it with hope." A few days later, Claire published an article titled "The Unseen Hands of Kindness." It didn't mention Sandra directly. It told stories of lives changed by invisible goodness, by people who gave without expecting thanks. It spread like light through darkness. People began sharing their own acts of quiet kindness. Teachers buying supplies for poor students. Neighbors repairing each other's homes. Strangers leaving food for those in need. For the first time, Sandra saw the world not talking about her, but doing something because of her. And that filled her heart with a peace she hadn't felt in years. She went for a walk that evening, unnoticed among the crowd. She passed a small bookstore and saw a sign on the window. "Kindness Week, inspired by a story." She smiled, eyes glistening with quiet joy. Maybe this was how goodness was meant to grow. Not shouted but shared, but somewhere far away. Another voice was preparing to twist her story again. A gossip reporter who saw only headlines, not hearts. The piece she found that evening was about to be tested in ways she never expected. When kindness was questioned, days turned into weeks, and though the noise had started to calm, not everyone saw the story for what it truly was. The same world that once praised Sandra now began to twist her silence again. On talk shows, people debated whether her acts were real or just a clever image move. Headlines appeared with words she never wanted near her name. Was it all staged? Anonymous no more? A perfect publicity plan? And even though Claire's article had brought peace to millions, the new wave of gossip hit harder. Sandra avoided interviews. She stayed home, quiet, her phone turned off. She had always believed that goodness didn't need defending. But now, as she watched lies being sold as entertainment, something inside her began to ache. That evening, Claire came to visit again. She looked worried. "They're twisting everything," she said softly. "Some people think I made the story up for attention. They're calling me fake too." Sandra smiled faintly. "That's how truth walks through noise, slow and bruised," she said. "But we can't let them ruin this," Claire replied, her voice breaking. "This story changed people's hearts. I saw it. I read the letters." Sandra placed her hand gently over Claire's. "Then let them talk. We'll keep doing what matters." But even as she said those words, Sandra could feel the pressure growing. Big media networks kept calling. One of them threatened to release evidence, photos, tax documents, personal records, to prove her secret donations weren't so secret after all. Her manager begged her to speak up publicly, to hold a press conference to clear her name. But Sandra shook her head. "You don't defend kindness," she said softly. "You just keep doing it." She spent the next few days driving outside the city, far from the flashing lights, stopping at small towns where no one recognized her. She visited the old community kitchen she had helped rebuild. She saw people laughing there, eating together, sharing stories. No cameras, no headlines, just life. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace. But peace rarely stays untouched. When she returned home, she found 2 reporters waiting outside her gate. One of them called out, "Miss Bullock, is it true you've been secretly paying charities to promote your image?" She stopped, looked at them for a long second, and then said quietly, "No one pays people to feel hope. That's something the heart gives on its own." The reporters said nothing. One of them lowered his camera. There was something in her eyes, calm, steady, unshaken, that made their words feel small. That night, Sandra sat by her window again, the same one where years ago she had watched rain slide down the glass. The city below glowed like 1,000 restless thoughts. She thought about her mother again, and her words echoed in her mind. "If the world ever doubts your goodness, keep doing it louder, not with words, but with action." So she decided to act again. Quietly, but this time differently. She called Claire. "I want to start something," she said. "A trust fund. For students, nurses, teachers, single mothers, anyone who quietly helps others. But I don't want it to have my name." "Then what will you call it?" Claire asked. Sandra smiled. "The Silent Hands Foundation." They both sat on the phone for a while, not speaking, but feeling something powerful. A kind of peace that comes when purpose finally finds its voice again. "I'll help you build it," Claire said. "No," Sandra replied softly. "You'll help me protect it." Weeks later, the world began to forget the gossip. News cycles moved on and people returned to their lives. But somewhere quietly, the Silent Hands Foundation began to grow. Not through ads or press, but through whispers. A teacher in a small town received funds to rebuild a classroom. A nurse got help to care for her sick mother. A group of students started free reading clubs in underprivileged areas. None of them knew where the money came from. They only knew it came from a place that believes in quiet kindness. And far away, Sandra watched it all happen quietly, from a distance. She never signed a check. She never gave an interview. She never asked for thanks. But every time she saw a smile, a rebuilt wall, or a child reading under a repaired roof. She felt her heart grow lighter, because now, kindness no longer belonged to her. It belonged to everyone. One evening, Claire called again. Her voice sounded different, softer, full of wonder. "You should see it," she said. "Your kindness has started a chain. People are donating anonymously everywhere now. There's even a tag online, Silent Hands Movement. It's spreading across countries." Sandra laughed quietly. "Then it worked," she said. "It finally stopped being about me." "No," Claire replied gently. "It started being about what you believed." And in that moment, Sandra felt something deeper than happiness. It was peace, not the kind that comes from silence, but from knowing your silence had changed the world. The light that stayed months passed quietly. The noise of the world had moved on to other stories, other scandals, other faces. Yet somewhere in the calm behind it all, the Silent Hands Foundation kept growing, quietly, kindly, like light seeping through cracks in a dark room. Sandra lived away from the city now, in a small coastal town where mornings began with the sound of waves and ended with silence. She had planted a small garden behind her home. The flowers bloomed unevenly, but beautifully, much like the people she had helped. Imperfect, real and full of color. She rarely went online. But one evening, while scrolling through old letters on her tablet, she stumbled across a video shared by a school. It was a small classroom in a village she had never visited. The children stood in front of a banner that read, "Thank you, Silent Hands." They were singing. Their voices cracked and wavered, but they sang with pure joy. Her eyes filled with tears. She smiled softly. No one in that video knew who she was, and that made it even more perfect. One morning, Claire arrived at her home again. She looked different, calmer, wiser, a little older from everything she had seen. They sat together in the garden under the slow warmth of the sun. "The foundation has helped almost 50 towns now," Claire said. "But the strange part is we don't even know who half the donors are anymore. People just give, some anonymously, some in memory of others. It's spreading." Sandra smiled quietly. "That's how kindness should move. Without name, without noise." Claire looked at her for a long moment. "Do you ever miss being known for your work? For who you are?" Sandra thought about it, then shook her head. "I used to think being seen was proof that I mattered," she said softly. "But now I see it differently. Being felt is more powerful than being seen." A small breeze moved through the garden, lifting a few petals into the air. Claire watched them swirl and land near Sandra's feet. "You know," Claire said gently, "people online are calling you the woman who made kindness fashionable again." Sandra laughed quietly. "Kindness doesn't need fashion. It just needed someone to remind people it never went out of style." A few days later, Sandra received another letter. It wasn't from a fan or a foundation, but from the old librarian, the same man from the town where everything had started. His handwriting was shaky now, but his message was simple. "Dear Miss Sandra, our library is still open. It's been 20 years since that night you left a note under the door. I didn't tell anyone then, but I always knew it was you. I just wanted you to know that your one act didn't just save books. It saved hope. Children still come every day. They laugh, they read, they dream. Maybe someday they'll do for others what you did for them. Thank you for believing in stories, especially the ones no one else hears." She read it twice, then held the letter close to her chest. For a moment, she felt her heart whisper back, "This is why you did it." She walked to her window, looked out at the sea, and whispered, "The story was never mine. It was theirs." Years later, Claire's book, Silent Hands, The Kindness That Moved the World, was released. It didn't have Sandra's picture on the cover, and nowhere in its pages did it say her name. It simply told stories of small towns, hospitals, libraries, and ordinary people who helped others without asking for thanks. But anyone who read it felt her presence between the lines. Quiet, steady, and full of warmth. The book became a movement. People from around the world began to write letters about the anonymous good they had done. Kindness had finally found a voice again. Not loud, not proud, but deeply human. And through it all, Sandra stayed in her little home by the sea, planting new flowers, writing small letters of encouragement to strangers, and smiling at sunsets. She had given the world something greater than fame. She had given it memory, a memory that kindness still mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped into the ocean, Claire came to visit her once more. They sat quietly. No cameras, no headlines, just two souls who had walked through truth together. "You know," Claire said softly, "people still ask who started the Silent Hands Foundation. I always tell them, someone who believed in love more than attention." Sandra smiled, her eyes glistening. "That's all they ever need to know." The waves rolled gently against the shore. The sky turned golden, then quiet. And for the first time in a long time, Sandra felt the peace she had always been searching for. Not the silence of hiding, but the calm of knowing she had done enough.